things in Cambridge?
Well, we're in lockdown the way India is, and that's a surreal environment and existence for all of us in both India and the United States. Our country's in deep, deep political and existential crisis, and I think that's what's really gripping all of us right now.
What do you think is going on in the United States? Why are we seeing these images?
In the U.S., we've had a problem of race, of mistreatment of African Americans. Since the beginning of the founding of the country, the first slave ships arrived here in 1619. That's the year before the Pilgrims came from England to settle Massachusetts Bay Colony, where I live now. And you think about our Civil War, fought over slavery. Our greatest, I think, American of the last 100 years is Martin Luther King Jr. He fought battles, peaceful, nonviolent battles, because, of course, his idol, his spiritual idol was Mahatma Gandhi.
Yes.
He modeled his movement after the Gandhi movement to liberate India from British rule, the peaceful nonviolence. King led us to become a better country. We elected an African-American president, Barack Obama, a man I deeply respect. And yet you see race come back now. You see African-Americans mistreated, this horrible, horrible murder of George Floyd, this young African-American man, by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have millions of Americans trying to protest peacefully, as is our right, as is your right in India. And yet the president treats them all like terrorists. In many ways, India and the United States share many, many traits. We were both subjects of the British Empire. We both liberated ourselves from that empire in different centuries, but we did. I've always admired India. I've always admired the multiracial, multi-religious aspect of Indian society. And so countries sometimes have to go through a discussion and a political debate about who are we? At the core, what kind of nation are we? We're an immigrant nation. We're a tolerant nation.
I mean, I think the thing we share, and I think why our partnership works, is because we are tolerant systems. You mentioned that you're an immigrant nation. We are a very, very tolerant nation. Our DNA is supposed to be tolerant. We're supposed to accept new ideas. We're supposed to be open. But the surprising thing is that that open DNA is sort of disappeared. I mean, I say this with sadness that I don't see that level of tolerance that I used to see. I don't see it in the United States, and I don't see it in India.
I think you've identified a central issue, at least for the United States. And the silver lining here, the good news is that we have people demonstrating all across the country in every major city in the United States this week, peacefully, on behalf of tolerance, inclusion, minority rights, all these essential issues at the core of our democracy. And I think one advantage that we democracies have, say, over an authoritarian country like China, is that we can correct ourselves as a self-corrective part of our national DNA in India and the United States. And as all democracies, we resolve this at the ballot box in free and fair elections. We do not turn to violence. We do this peacefully. That's the India tradition that we love about India from your founding. Yeah. In the 1930s, the protest movement, the Salt March, all the way to 1947 and 48. So I take the rule that, I can't comment on your country because I don't know it nearly as well, obviously, but my country, I think, will be back. We'll be back. We'll strengthen our democracy.
But I feel that this division which occurs is actually tremendously weakening for the country. But the people who do the division portray it as the strength of the country. When you divide African Americans, Mexicans, and other people in the United States, or you divide Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs in India, you're weakening the structure of the country. But then the same people who weaken the structure of the country say that they're the nationalists.
Well, I think that's what President Trump is all about. He wraps himself in a flag. He declares that he alone can fix the problems. I must say, I think President Trump is in many ways an authoritarian personality. But in our country, you're seeing the institutions remain strong. Mm-hmm. The military clearly saying over the last few days, individual senior military leaders, we will not put American military troops onto the streets. That's the function of the police forces, not the military force. We'll abide by the Constitution. The senior military officer, General Mark Milley, said this week, Americans have a right to protest. They have a right to disagree with the government. These are so fundamental. It's extraordinary we have to even debate these. So we're back to debating first principles. But again, I do see strengths that democracies go through trials. We play out our differences in political campaigns or in street protests, but at least we can do that. You can see authoritarianism coming back in China, in Russia. And we democracies, we sometimes go through painful episodes because of our freedoms, but we're so much stronger because of them. That's our advantage, I think, inherently over the authoritarian countries.
When we look at the relationship between India and the United States, there's been a lot of progress over the last couple of decades. But one of the things I've noticed is that a relationship that used to be a partnership seems to have become very transactional. It's become episodic and transactional, and then a relationship that used to be very broad, education, defense, healthcare, multiple fronts, has sort of focused down mainly on defense. I mean, what do you think about where the relationship between India and the United States is going?
Well, from an American perspective, it's interesting in our country right now, Democrats and Republicans agree on very little in our Congress, but there is, I think, nearly universal support in both of our political parties that the United States ought to have a very close, supportive, and all-encompassing relationship with India. We're the two largest global democracies. I would argue we're the two most important global democracies. The secret weapon in the relationship, I'm sure you'll agree, has been the Indian-American community. It's an extraordinary community in the United States. They started out, lots of engineers and scientists staying on in the 1970s and 80s, becoming doctors in our hospitals. We now have, as you know, senior political leaders in Congress, in state governors, senators who are Indian American. We have Indian Americans in every facet of life. Yeah. Some of our major tech companies in California, our CEOs are Indian Americans. So I think there's been a maturation of that community, and it's a profound bridge between the two countries. So I'm very hopeful that the U.S. and India, our societies, not just our governments, but our society, very close, intertwined, integrated. And that's a great strength if you think that one of the challenges we face is the coming power of authoritarian countries. I mentioned two before, China and Russia. We never want to fight. We don't want war. But we want to preserve our way of life, and we want to preserve our positions in the world. And that's why I think so much of our relationship is so important between our two countries for that reason.
I think the Indian American community is a real asset for us and an asset for you. So it's a joint asset, and it's a good bridge to have. How does one think about that going forward?
Well, I think that to mention something you said before, Rahul, our military relationship is very strong. If you think about the U.S.-India naval and Air Force cooperation in the Bay of Bengal and throughout the entire Indian Ocean region, we're really together, and this gives me hope. But you're right. It can't be just about that. And so my advice would be, but I would look forward to your thoughts, is keep the doors open to each other. Lower the restrictions on the movement of peoples between the two countries. I think H-1B visas, where a lot of university, high-tech Indian business people come to the United States on H-1B visas, they've been severely limited in recent years. We simply don't have enough engineers in the United States to run our economy. And India can supply many of those engineers. I'd keep the barriers low. I would encourage the movement of people, encourage university exchanges, and certainly encourage us to be working together on democracy promotion around the world, on science, on public health issues. If there's another pandemic in our future, and there most likely is, of some sort, our two countries could be doing a lot more together in terms of vaccine for poorer members of our society. I'd like to see our relationship go in that direction as well.
If I look at the history of the United States, and I go back over the last century, I see big ideas, right? I see the Marshall Plan. I see how the United States worked with Japan, for example. I see how the United States worked with the Koreans, and these societies were transformed. I don't see that right now. I'll be very blunt with you. I don't see that type of a vision coming from the United States that is transformative. And one doesn't expect regional ideas from the United States. One expects global ideas from the United States.
Well, that is a big idea in itself, the search for a big idea. I remember we were working very closely with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. You'll remember this.
Yeah.
And our relationship, when I was involved centrally with the Indian government, it really was focused on trade. It was focused on the military relationship. And we were always searching for your big idea. You're right, because we have something very precious in common, and that's our democratic traditions. I still think that finding a way for Indians and Americans and our governments to combine forces to promote human freedom, promote democracy, promote rule of the people in the world, I think that is a powerful idea that Indians and Americans can bring together to the rest of the world. Again, we are not looking for a conflict with China, but we are waging, in a way, a battle of ideas with China. We can't decouple ourselves or de-link ourselves from China. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
I'd say cooperative competition without ever going into violence. Yes, they have a different worldview. Yes, they have an authoritarian worldview. Yes, we have a democratic worldview. And I'm pretty confident that the democratic worldview will do well. But in order to achieve that, that has to start from inside our countries. We can't have a authoritarian perspective internally and then make that argument. That argument has to be made from the foundation of democracy within the country itself, within our countries. And that's where I see the problem, that it becomes very difficult for us to, from our perspective, to make an argument of democracy when our institutions are being torn apart, when our people are scared, when millions of people in our country are terrified of what's going to happen to them. The most important battle, from our perspective, yours and ours, is to actually bring back our countries to where they used to be, which is sort of where we embrace our cultures, where we embrace our past, where we embrace our people, and where we sort of we give a healing touch, as opposed to this sort of aggressive politics that we're stuck in.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. That India and the United States can be working together, not to, as you say, not to fight China, but to make it observe the rule of law as we try to live together in this world.
Why do you think that in this COVID crisis, and I say this for most countries, including India and the United States, why do you think there has been almost no cooperation?
I think you and I have talked about this before. It's a terrible, terrible disappointment to me. I'm sure it is to you. You know, this crisis was made for the G20. It was made for Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump to be working together, all of our countries, for the common global good. All of us are confronted. Every Indian American is vulnerable to this disease. And I would have thought at the beginning of the crisis, I would have predicted that countries would have put down their differences and worked for a vaccine together, or how to distribute that vaccine in an equitable and humane fashion. And it hasn't happened, mainly because Donald Trump doesn't really believe in international cooperation. He's a unilateralist. He wants America to go it alone in the world. And Xi Jinping chose to compete with Trump. Been the U.S. and China at the heart of the problem here. And I hope when the next crisis comes, we'll do better to work together in a more effective way.
And it's the same. It's the same in Europe. I mean, one sees the same friction between Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom that one sees across the world. So there is something happening in the world where people are going into themselves, becoming insular. And I think this COVID crisis has accelerated that sense. A few days ago, I had a similar conversation like this with one of the big business people in India. And he said to me, look, before I spoke to you, some of my friends called me up and said, don't speak to him, it will be very bad for you, bad things will happen to you. And so there is this atmosphere of fear. You take unilateral decisions. You do the biggest lockdown in the world, most rigorous lockdown in the world, and then you have millions and millions of your manual laborers walking thousands of kilometers back home. So it's this unilateral, episodic type of leadership where you just come in, do something, and go away. It's very, very destructive. But it's the flavor of the times. That's the unfortunate thing. It's everywhere, and we are fighting it.
These are difficult days, and all over the world. I think they're difficult days. A major political party.
100%. See, I'm 100%. I'm hopeful. I'll tell you why I'm hopeful. Because I understand the DNA of my country, and I know that for thousands of years the DNA of my country has been of one type, and it can't be changed. So yes, we are going through a bad patch. COVID is after COVID. New ways. I can already see people cooperating much more than they were before. Now they realize that actually there are advantages to being unified. There are advantages to helping each other. So that is there. How do you think COVID is going to shape the balance of power? What is going to happen in your view between the United States, China, Russia, India? What is going to be the effect of COVID?
That we set aside global political rivalries on issues like climate change or pandemics, because these issues are existential for everyone. They unite every person in the world, 7.7 billion people. We need to have a future of global politics. Of course, we're going to compete. China and the United States, India and the United States, but we need to preserve space that we can work together on behalf of individual people around the world and give those people some hope that we as governments can help them. That's the challenge with COVID. If you think of it, the last 7 years we've had SARS, H1N1, Ebola, and now the coronavirus. 4 pandemics in 17 years. We will have another pandemic in the next 4 or 5 years. Can we respond as a global community more effective? Can we work together? I think that's the great challenge that I see coming out of COVID.
And in terms of the balance of power, do you think that's going to shift in any way, or do you think that's going to stay the same? Or what is going to be?
I think a lot of people right now are saying that China is going to surpass. China's winning the battle. China certainly has extraordinary power in the world. Probably not equal to the United States militarily, economically, politically yet, but it's gaining, no question about it. What China lacks is the sophistication and openness of a democratic country like India or the United States. China's a fearful leadership, fearful men trying to preserve their own power, increasing the grip that they have on their own citizens. Look what's happening in Xinjiang, against the Uyghurs and in Hong Kong, just to give those examples. And I actually think I'm hopeful about the future of India and the United States. I worry the Chinese system is not going to be flexible enough to accommodate the desires of the Chinese people for human freedom and liberty. So I'm a champion of democracy, as are you. I have confidence that democracies will survive these tests. Imagine, Rahul, one last question for you. It changes politics. You can't speak to a crowd.
I don't shake hands, but I go into contact with people with a mask and stuff.
Yeah.
But it does, because public meetings are not possible, and that's the lifeblood of politics here. So a lot of social media, a lot of Zoom conversations on Zoom are happening. It is going to change. It is going to change some habits in the political sphere for sure. In India, it's also changed the psychology because of the lockdown and the way it was done. There is quite a lot of fear in the air. People believe that the virus is a very, very serious disease, which it is, but they're convinced that it is a fatal disease. So that sort of needs to be slowly removed as the virus fades out. That sense of fear.
I was just going to say our battle here is to maintain social distancing, try to convince people to wear a mask just like it is in India, because people are beginning to let down their guard in the United States, particularly young people. And another reason, I think, to keep the universities closed is to protect people. And so I think having that discipline to maintain these kind of shutdown is very important to get through this in the future.
Thank you, Ambassador. And lovely chatting to you. And do get in touch when you're here.
I certainly will. I'll come by to see you, and all best to you and to your family.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank